There's no one at the board.
That's fine, I still need to finish sending this email.
Okay.
Well, I don't think anyone's gonna be able to. Yeah, I'm sending it.
Okay.
Oh, okay, you're right,
Yeah. Good evening, everybody. I will call the meeting to order. First order of business is Pledge of Allegiance. I'd ask you to stand if you're able and join me. I pledge
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Welcome, everybody. We just have one piece of business to do before we start, and that is the MEC boiler replacement award letter. Sarah put in our Dropbox today that there were 3 bidders. The engineer looked over, and so I'm going to turn it over to Sarah. I have the letter up just so you can.
Thank you. So as you are aware, we went out to bid for the MEC boilers. We received a number of bids. The 3 lowest bids were given to the engineer. The engineer, as I explained to the people in the room when I opened the bids, I have a degree in mathematics. I don't know anything about boilers, so that's why we have an engineer on the project. I gave the bids from the 3 lowest bidders to the engineer. He spent the time reviewing and checking references, and then presented me with this letter recommending the lowest qualified bidder as the Wilkinson Company out of Rockland, Massachusetts. So I present this to you with the recommendation that we move forward with this company.
The chair would entertain a motion to award the contract to the Wilkinson Companies in the amount of $262,983.
So moved.
Do I hear a second? Second. Discussion. And again, it's the lowest qualified bidder, and that's the engineer who was in charge of looking at the program for us. Any further? Yeah.
Mr. Chair, just, do we have a timeline on this? I may have missed that last meeting, but just curious as to when this would be done. I know we wanted to get moving quickly, but.
We have 2 big projects going on at the MEC right now, and so I guess the best way to say it is the chiller, which will run the air conditioning, is going to be online for summer, and the boilers are going to be online for next winter.
Perfect, thank you.
So just to be clear, it's going to start out with working on the chiller first, in case people couldn't hear Sarah, and then it will go to make sure the boilers are online by the time winter rolls around. So everything should be by the time in the seasons that they're needed. Excellent. Any other question? Rich?
Sure, obviously respect the engineer's decision on who. I'm just curious, have we ever had any experiences with that particular company before, and if so, were they good?
That is a question for Jim Hutchinson, and I can get you the answer to that. But to answer the are they good part, we're talking about a company that is DCAM certified, which is the Division of Capital and Asset Management in Massachusetts. So this isn't just anybody could put in a bid for the project. When we say qualified, their qualifications are, it's kind of like Angie's List, except it's not household projects, it's construction projects.
Got it.
And just so everybody may not have heard, the company is DCAM certified, meaning the capital improvement management from the state approves of the company, certifies the company. And in addition, Sarah's not 100% sure, we've used the company in the past, but is going to talk with Hutch, our Director of Facilitation.
Sure. And Mr. Chair, I'm not obviously willing to hold up my vote on this. I know that the engineer stakes their reputation on the company that they choose. I was just curious. Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions? And I should also note that Martin Richardson was the person we were using as the engineer, but the Wilkinson's company is also the lowest bidder, not only the lowest qualified bidder. With that, all those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? It's unanimous. Thank you. Now we'll get to the main point of the night. So tonight we're here to interview Carolyn Lyons, for a candidate for superintendent. Just so everyone understands how it's going to go, I'm going to offer Carolyn an opportunity to speak first. And then I will go to each of you to ask questions. We'll do that until we have sort of run out of questions. And then I'm going to take a break for a few minutes, just so everyone can recoil for a few seconds, and then we'll discuss afterwards, okay? So with that, Carolyn, welcome. You've been here many times in other capacities, but I appreciate you coming, and I'll turn the floor over to you.
Great, thank you. So, hello, I am Carolyn Lyons. I am your current Director of Pupil Personnel Services for the Middleborough Public Schools. I am seeking the position of Superintendent of Schools because, simply put, I want to move our district forward. I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself tonight, a little bit about my work with Middleborough over the past 15 years, and then what I see as the future plan to best meet the needs of 3,100 students in this community. I grew up in Avon, Massachusetts, not too far from here. I am one of 6 children in my family. I went to college at Smith College. I graduated with a double major in government and economics, which I completed in 3.5 years. And I went on to law school after taking a brief hiatus. I went to Suffolk University Law School in Boston. I practiced law with a focus on education law until I took a position here in Middleborough in 2012. Education has been part of my path all along, even if it was not the primary path I set out to follow. And reflecting on this process exposed that for me as I've reflected on it for years as I've become the educator I am today. In high school, I actually had the opportunity to intern with my own 2nd grade teacher in the Avon Public Schools, and it was a wonderful experience. Getting to work with young children, getting to understand, even as a high school student, what their needs were. At college, when I was in college, I actually worked with the pre-K population in a daycare setting. So those students were ages 2.5 through 5. So similar to our pre-K population here in our district. I had the opportunity to work at a teen center on Nantucket Island for several summers, working with teenage students. This was a night job that was weekend nights and an alternative to getting into trouble or otherwise for local teens there. And then I had the opportunity to teach 9th grade English over the summer, also with Nantucket schools in a credit recovery sort of setup. And this was all while I was pursuing actually my law career. So from there, I moved on to the firm of Murphy, Hesse, Toomey, and Lehane, and I'll tell you a little bit about that in a moment. Before I do that, besides being a lawyer and an educator, I have to point out that I am also a mother. I have a son who's 10 years old, whose name is Grady. I have a 6-year-old daughter whose name is Scarlett. Hi, kids. I know you're watching. Don't stay up too late. I am blessed with a husband of over 15 years, and I share this with you and the community because my lens as a mother colors everything I do and every decision I make. So as I mentioned, I've worked with Middleborough in some capacity since 2007. When I was working for Murphy, Hesse, Toomey, and Lehane, this is a law firm in Quincy that represents school districts. They did more than education law, but I was in their education law department. And they represented over 150 school districts across the state of Massachusetts. Middleborough was one of my first clients. And I worked continuously with Middleborough starting in 2007. Middleborough was one of about anywhere from 15 to 18 communities I worked with on any given kind of regular basis there. When I began my work in Middleborough, what struck me, and I've talked to you about it before when I became your PPS director, was the quality of staff that were here. I met people like Melissa Deutschman and Mari Gates and Lisa McDonald. Some of these people have been here over 20 years. And I knew that there was something special in this community. I was excited every time I got to come. So when I stepped out of the law and I was making a decision to join an educational institution, I like to say that Middleborough chose me as much as I chose it. And I'm proud to tell you I haven't left. And I've committed to this community many, many times over that time period. When I joined Middleborough Public Schools, I stepped into a role of secondary special education team facilitator for grades 6 through 12, which is a mouthful. I also managed the entire out-of-district caseload for the district. So what that means is essentially I was balancing half of the district's special education population by myself. I ran initial and 3-year reevaluation meetings. I oversaw the entire special education staff at Nichols and also the high school. And I played a central role in professional development. Professional development is a continuing thread, not just with my work at the firm, but also here in the district, which is one of the reasons I gave you an addendum with my paperwork. I wanted you to see the expansive topics that I've provided professional development on. I spent a lot of time in my legal career teaching educational institutions about the law and specifically about special education. It was one of the things I liked to do the most. So I used to train special education team facilitators. I would train superintendents. I would train sometimes entire school districts, as I did. I would come into an auditorium like this. The entire district would be there. This was how I spent my time when I wasn't involved in litigation or other matters related to education. When I stepped into the district here, I brought that with me. So one of my first assignments on the job that summer was that I trained our entire administrative team on discipline law. Student discipline law is what I'm referring to. But professional development has remained not only an interest and a joy of mine, but something that I've consistently done. And it's oftentimes functioned as a cost savings mechanism for this district. I also built relationships with staff and my families. And that's something that I think is an asset to my candidacy as the superintendent. I would not need to spend any time building relationships with any member of your administrative team in particular, but my relationships extend far beyond that. In 2016, I took on the role of Director of Pupil Personnel Services, and you gave me that opportunity that I have held since that time. I stepped into that role because I felt that my skill set could benefit all families. I'll talk to you a little bit about PPS in a moment, but my desire was to stretch my skill set beyond what I had been doing at that time. Pupil Personnel Services is, as you know, a large department, and it covers many different aspects of what we do here in the district. It involves the oversight of all special education, ranging in age from kids who turn 3 and age into the system all the way through 22. It includes the oversight of our 504 process, 504 being Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which governs all students and all employees who may present with a disability. It involves, my job involves school nursing and the oversight of all school nursing. Our Medicaid program, which involves the submission of medically necessary services for reimbursement, which is a way to actually earn money in our district, one of the few times where we can do that. I also serve as the homeless liaison. Homelessness is governed by a statute, it's a federal statute, the McKinney-Vento Act, but Massachusetts also has accompanying regulations. And for students who are touched by homelessness, they're entitled to prompt enrollment, access to transportation, and equality of access of all educational services. Additionally, I'm also the Civil Rights Coordinator for the district. This again involves professional development and education. I've taken a lead role in our mandatory trainings. One of my favorite things is to talk about something like Title IX and break it down so that people can actually understand what it means. I'm the Harassment Coordinator for the district, which governs all students and all employees. And as I just mentioned, I'm the Title IX Coordinator and the Title VI Coordinator. Title IX covering discrimination on the basis of sex. Title VI prohibiting discrimination on the basis of race, color, or national origin. Since 2016, and aside from these duties, I've led some initiatives that I want to share with you that I also included in my packet. And I want to be clear about my role in these initiatives. When I say that I'm sharing these initiatives with you, that doesn't mean I did everything. And I would never take credit from the tremendously hardworking staff in this district. What I can share is that these initiatives either were my idea or they were overseen by me from start to finish. So as I came into my PPS role, one of the first things, actually one of the first conversations I ever had with the budget subcommittee was that I wanted to expand our behavior department. At the time, we had a board-certified behavior analyst, which is ultimately a scientist of behavior. And that person was a little over half-time. And I wanted to expand the department because I could see that student behavior was something that we were seeing at school. And rather than continue to discipline students and take them further away from their education, what I wanted to do was arm our staff with additional tools to more effectively manage those behaviors. I am proud to tell you that this department has blossomed under my leadership. We now have a board-certified behavior analyst who is 0.8, 4 days a week, and 3 registered behavior technicians. This was also a cost savings mechanism as I expanded this department. Board-certified behavior analysts have more education and thus cost more money. Registered behavior technicians have an amazing and tremendous skill set, but they cost less money. So the wisdom behind bringing on manpower was, of course, I need to develop a department, but let's not find that department in the most expensive way possible. You will hear over this presentation that I am absolutely fiscally conservative when it comes to Middleborough's money and public money in general. Special education program evaluation is something that I spearheaded from the time I moved into this position in 2016. All special education programs need to be evaluated. It's part of our obligation. It's part of my obligation under the Director of Special Education aspect of my role. And that makes sense because you want to calibrate what we're doing with students. We have to make sure that translates into actual progress. Historically, even in this district and others, special ed directors bring people in, experts, to come in and analyze their programs. This can range from a few $1,000s to tens of thousands of dollars in expenditures. At the time, I had 4 coordinators. No, I had 1, 2, 3, 4, I had 5, excuse me. I had more than 4 coordinators. I had 4 full-time coordinators and a 0.6 coordinator. And that team had just a tremendous depth of skill. And so we took on program evaluation by ourselves, saving the district tens of thousands of dollars. And I'd like to tell you what that yielded was us not only being able to look at our programming, but then have a real hands-on approach of what exactly needs to be fixed. There are other processes that I've engaged in through this part of my job that was mandatory. And in these processes, these are state audits or events that you have no choice but to comply with as a district. That involves tiered focus monitoring, which used to be called coordinated program review, civil rights data collection, which is federal, that's not state, and then the educational stability review, which looks at how we have managed kids who have been touched by homelessness or foster care. I'm very proud of the results of our tiered focus monitoring and the coordinated program review. And I share that with you again, not as my own victory, but as the victory of a very strong department. In the 2 times I have overseen the special ed process for tiered focus monitoring, there have been no citations of anything that wasn't implemented. I know it's a convoluted way of talking about it, but you're given a rating of whether or not you're fully implemented, partially implemented, or not implemented. It's always been the standard that you get cited with something. We got cited with nothing. And the last time they came through, I oversaw civil rights, and we were cited with nothing. That means total compliance. This is what you want. You want your district to be functioning at its highest efficiency and capacity. Beyond that, I have additional initiatives that are really since the era of COVID. I'm particularly proud of these initiatives because it exemplifies some of the pieces of my leadership that I would bring forward as superintendent. The first one is the Family Support Channel. The Family Support Channel was my idea. And in the middle of the school shutdown, we were fielding calls from parents, understandably so, who were not sure how to best help their kids at home. Schools were closed for the first time, for a very long time, and they were trying to set up workstations for their children. They weren't sure where to put those workstations, what they should look like. They weren't sure if their child was behaving in a way that was developmentally appropriate. So what the PPS department did was they created little tiny snippet videos, 4 minutes, 6 minutes, 2 minutes, on a wide variety of topics. Kate Cooney from our OT department did a couple of videos on handwriting and pencil grasp. Because if you're at home working with your child, you may not know that, right? If you're not an occupational therapist, that's not an unreasonable thing. We had counselors write up or perform little videos. These are all audio-visual, so it wasn't anything anyone had to read or weed through, and they weren't very long. But there were videos on what the workstation could look like, how to minimize distraction, what's developmentally appropriate for a 5-year-old. If you've ever worked with a 5-year-old, you know there's a big band in what to expect in terms of, readiness skills for academics. Understandably, we had a lot of parents panicking. So again, this cost us no money and was a way to outreach to parents. I'm very proud of that initiative because other communities did it differently, if they did it at all. And it was all homegrown and it was all run by us. An initiative that launched this year is called Wellness for You, and it's a wellness newsletter that goes to our staff, goes to our employees once a month. Kevin Avitable, who I presented with last week, is my sort of editor-in-chief, along with 2 school psychologists, Kira Drugan and Kylie Bowen. Again, this initiative costs $0 to release. And what it does is it demonstrates, it's one small feature, but what it demonstrates to our staff is that they matter. And that's important to me too. We are absolutely a service industry, and as much as we are constantly caring about our 3,100, we have to take care of our own too. Lastly is the Equity Committee. And I wanted to talk to you about the Equity Committee because this is a new initiative this year. Paul Brannigan and I partnered in establishing an Equity Committee for the first time. And understandably, a lot of questions came up. What does that mean for Middleborough? What exactly are we talking about? What we're really talking about is creating our school environment to be a place that is accessible and welcoming to everybody. Whether you work here, whether you're a student who attends here, whether you're a family member that visits here. We divided our equity committee into subcommittees, which we did so that we could have a focus. As you can imagine, equity is getting a lot of attention in the news. And Paul's concern, along with mine, was that we wanted to make sure we focused our work so that we had purpose and that we were keeping our tasks focused on things that related to schooling and our education. So what we're looking at are our hiring practices. Do they reflect a procedure that's going to yield the best possible employees here in the district? Are they truly equal opportunity? Our facilities, are they accessible to all? Jim Hutchinson actually heads up that subcommittee. So for example, if you are in a wheelchair, are you able to access all aspects of educational programming here in our district? One of the best ways to do that is to take an equity walk. Procedures and policies. How are things written when we're giving out procedures to parents or sharing something with them or asking for permission? Is that written in a way that's welcoming of everybody? Curriculum instruction and materials. What information are we presenting to students? Can all students see themselves in what they're learning? Do the characters look like them? Do they sound like them? Do they talk like them? And then lastly, opportunities for learning, because we fully recognize that not only is this ongoing work, but none of us are experts. You know, you can take equity work and look at it from many different angles, but I think the most important thing is to open up conversation and be able to talk about these issues and talk about creating spaces in a non-offensive way and in a way that welcomes difference of opinion. The COVID years were a turning point for me. I was a parent through this entire experience. My daughter was in a pre-K setting that shut down, and my son was in 3rd grade in an elementary school that shut down. I share this with you because this tethered me to the parent experience, not just in my community, but especially here in Middleborough. It's not lost on me that I spent all of my time focusing on education. I would often go to work and worry about the 3,100 here and then go home and worry about the 2 I had at home. What struck me about that experience was how well Middleborough did. I'm tremendously proud of the effort that this district put forward for its students. I brag about it every chance I get, including in my home community. And what I like to say about Middleborough is that they always kept their students the top priority. Above all else, you had people just sort of running towards the building on fire instead of away. When I spoke and addressed the entire staff on Convocation Day this year, I compared them to a compass because compasses inherently point north. And that's what an educational community is. It functions as a compass and really a beacon for the community. And I'm tremendously proud of that effort. Despite that effort and despite everything that everybody did, it's not been lost on me that our momentum as a district has been stalled. This is a natural byproduct of what's been going on for the last 2 years. This has impacted students, it's impacted families, it's impacted staff, administration. Whether you drive a bus to this school or teach an AP class, everybody was impacted by this experience and how long this experience has lasted. To me, it became my calling. The way out of this situation and the best answer I can give you is to move forward. That's why I applied for this job. I feel that I can help us move forward, drawing on not just what I know, but the relationships I've made. To me, our children have no time to waste. I give you the example of a current first grader, not just because I live with one. Your current first grade cohort has only known their formal education through the lens of COVID. They had disrupted pre-K, if they were at pre-K, and they came into school in a hybrid context. This year has been their first typical year. If we wait another 2 or 3 years to have a leader in our district that needs time to acclimate and learn people and develop an entry plan, those first graders will become third and fourth graders. And all of their foundational skills in reading, all of their mathematic and numeracy skills will have already been formed. They don't have time to wait. That creates a sense of urgency in me. What I'll say is that superintendents serve different purposes at different times, and I think this time is no different. I believe that MPS needs a leader with vision, someone who can identify our areas of improvement, and somebody who has a plan to get it done. So what I'd like to talk to you about, and I don't know if you want me to talk about it now, okay. What I'd like to talk to you about is my vision and what I think is truly the bones of an entry plan that would take someone new to our district a year to complete at earliest. I looked at different questions as I created this. I talked to multiple stakeholders in this community. This is not the product of just my brain power. This is the product of collaboration. This is the product of discussion. This is the product of consultation. And most of all, it's the product of putting children before everything else. So the questions I focused on were, what did we learn through COVID, right? What were the takeaways that were positive? What did we learn to do better? What are our priorities going forward? How do we decide which things we're going to focus on and when? What practices that we regularly engage in warrant change? What drives our decisions? Financial decisions are always, at the back burner, but they're not the only. And then whose voice is audible? Who can we hear? And who are we serving? What I've developed is a 6-point plan, and it targets 6 distinct areas. The first one is curriculum, and I put social emotional learning in with curriculum. I do that because, in my opinion, social emotional learning has to be embedded in everything we do. It is not extra. It is not something that you do after you're presenting your content. If we do not learn as a community to take care of the needs of our learners at the outset, it will not matter what content you put forward. As Kevin talked last week, part of this plan involves developing a centralized vision, curriculum, and screener for social emotional learning. Panorama is the software he was talking about. What Panorama does is create distinct and discrete skills, right? When I say social emotional learning, it feels a little squishy. What am I honestly talking about? What does that mean? But if I'm looking at how a student makes decisions when presented with choices, that's a lot more concrete. This will allow not only longitudinal data, because it would run from our population pre-K all the way through high school, but it would also give us the opportunity to kind of quantify our results and address behavior from a proactive rather than a reactive standpoint. I don't have to wonder why the student is, having an issue in class if I can see that it followed right after the demand for work. We need action plans that are effective and rooted in named skills. Our teachers need a toolkit in order to manage this. Along with SEL is curriculum in a larger context. Similar to SEL, we too need a centralized vision of our curriculum review, our curriculum selection. Dr. Terry Markolitis will be presenting on March 17th, and her work will be intimately tied to this part of the plan. The second tenet of this plan involves human resources. I have long found it interesting that there's no human resources department. It doesn't exist at the town, it doesn't exist in our school systems. That's not all that atypical. A lot of communities have that particular setup. But what came clear to me in COVID is that we were constantly addressing employment matters. And what we need are procedures to comprehensively manage those employment matters. We need not just procedures to effectively manage our staff, but those procedures, properly designed and drafted, would also promote the retention of high-quality staff. One of the most important things that we do here in this district is hire and retain staff. That consistency is what benefits our students. And every time high-quality staff leaves and walks out the door, not only is there a fiscal loss, but we've missed an opportunity for our kids. I'd like to see a continuation of SEL-based initiatives for our staff, much more than a newsletter. I think it's critical that we recognize as a community what our teachers and paraprofessionals and related service providers and our custodial staff, you name it. If you worked for Middleborough, you left it all on the mat for the last 2 years, and your cup is empty. So one of the ways you fill that up is by showing our employees that they're a part of this puzzle too. I'd like to cultivate procedures that promote better work-life balance. I talked about this with parents last night. And I want to be careful about how I talk about it because I don't want anyone to misinterpret any amount of blame. The loss of work-life balance came as a natural byproduct of what was going on. Nobody was going to an office. Nobody was leaving their home. Your commute was from your bed to your kitchen table or your office if you were lucky enough to have one. But what that meant is when you left for the day, you didn't actually leave for the day. I know I had that experience. I know my administrative team had that experience. The days just sort of turned to nights. And what's happened is that we've sort of stayed in that mode, again, as a desire to help our students. But this is something that we need to address because what I'm seeing is exhaustion. And that has to be something that we consider carefully going forward. I also want to be clear that that does not mean and should not be interpreted to mean that I want less for our students, because that's not what I'm suggesting. But I am making the point that if we don't take care and people burn out and people leave, it's really not going to matter. I see this as a very critical and pressing need. The third part of this plan involves student voice. Students need to have a voice in our process and our decision-making. They belong in the driver's seat of their education, not as passive participants sort of in the back of the car somewhere. This promotes self-control, accountability, and responsible decision-making. It also makes our students invested in what they do. I had the experience a couple of weeks ago. We had a high school group present to the entire leadership team. They're working with the Anti-Defamation League. And first of all, hearing them present to us was spectacular. Not only did it stress speaking and listening skills, something I would love to see enhanced, but they highlighted things for me, and I'll share them with you in a moment. But what struck me is we need to hear from them more. I want to see them at school committee more. I want to read about them on social media more. And I want to hear about the amazing things that happen every day. And I want to hear it out of them. So the fourth point relates to what the students were presenting on. As I mentioned in my equity work that I referenced earlier, I'd like to see the cultivation of an affirmative practice of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I would argue we're already well at work. I don't believe this is new. I don't believe Middleborough to be an unwelcoming place. But I do think that we do need an articulated vision of what this means in public schools. Students need to have a sense of belonging in their community to be successful. They have to belong, and they have to feel as though they belong. Cultivating practices and a vision of what that looks like will get us closer. Those kids I was talking about, they came and they read statements about how students feel as being part of our community. And those statements were not overly positive. because they were talking about they weren't talking about whether or not their classes were good or whether they had great relationships with teachers. They were talking about what it feels like to be different in the community and how it hits them. And it was a wake-up call for me. What I'd like to see is the expansion of the equity committee. I'd like to see additional stakeholders involved. Our equity committee work right now is internal. It's involving our staff, but I'd love to see it involve families. I'd love to see it involve students. And I'd love to see us continue our work with the Anti-Defamation League. What we really need is an entry plan at all 5 buildings so that we know where we're beginning this work. Paul Brannigan at Middleborough High School already has a group working with the ADL. So naturally, their entry point's gonna look different than how we engage with our pre-K and K students at the MEC. There's also a difference just in those 2 groups. So that information has to be carefully presented. The next item is data and our use of data. As you all know, we use Aspen as our data management system here in the district. And what I've noticed about Aspen over the course of the years in the rollout, I believe the rollout came out around 2013, if I'm not mistaken. But we haven't really looked at it since then. I mean, we use Aspen every day, but we haven't really analyzed or maximized its use. And it's time that we start looking at that platform and start asking, is this doing all the things we want it to do? Is it meeting our needs? I'd like to see an evaluation of our use of data, our storage of data, how we digitize that data, so how we're actually manipulating it, because it's much easier to use electronically than if it's all written out on papers like I do. And then our reliance, most importantly, our reliance on data to drive decisions. It's tempting to make decisions based on anecdotal evidence, or when you're collaborating and talking with someone, that person might be factually correct, but data actually tethers us to exactly what we're doing and exactly what we need. Data is what prevents us from buying the wrong program. Data is what prevents us from coming to the wrong conclusion about a student. So it's critically important that we look at that now. The last item on my list is facilities. And I spoke with Jim Hutchinson about this part, understandably, about this part of the plan, and I told him that, that I would be relying heavily on him if I'm selected. Elementary enrollment warrants a conversation and warrants some type of solution. One of our elementary schools has a higher enrollment than the other, and I think facilities might be playing a role in how we address that. Students need to be in classes that aren't overcrowded, and in order to get to that solution, you have to work with the principals, you have to work with the director of facilities, you have to cultivate a plan. You have to think about what makes sense. I'd like to see that. I'd like to see that happen. My last item is to maximize the student spaces that we have. One of the ways I want to do that is to put and centralize our administrative offices together. If you've ever been in the Nichols Middle School, up in the top floor in the A cluster, there's a professional development center, an office for the director of curriculum, an office for the director of pupil personnel services, and then the entire pupil personnel services office, which houses all of our student files. It takes up an entire wing of our middle school. This is a problem for me because it's student space. And yes, we all need to be somewhere, but it would be great to move these offices into a location where we are not taking student spaces away from them. This would allow for smaller class size at the middle school. And I know that our enrollment's increasing. So you have to have the forward vision to know we got to do something about that. I don't profess to have all the answers in facilities or really any of these tenets. What I can tell you is I know these to be critical issues that are hitting this district right now. What I can tell you is that I would work collaboratively with our entire team and our entire district to get to the right answer. I would always explain my thinking, as I've done here tonight, and as I've done every time I've been before you, for that matter. What I can tell you is that I look at this emblem, I don't know, maybe 60 times a day, this every student in every classroom, every day. That's born out of our mission statement, to foster a culture of excellence within every student, in every classroom, and every day. And that very much continues to be our shared goal. But I've been asking myself, how is it we're going to get there? That statement is a destination. What we need is a route. The root is through informed decision-making, thoughtful interventions, and meaningful results. I thank you for listening to me talk for so long, and if you have questions, I'd love to answer those.
Everybody has questions. So I'll go round robin. Zeke, I will start with you for the first question.
So I suppose, and you kind of already touched on this. So one of my questions for you is, what is a problem that you have solved since you've been working in the district, and how did you solve that problem?
Okay, thank you, great question. I use the word problem lightly, because to me, anything that's going on was already in good shape. I never want to give the impression that things aren't really wonderful around here, because I do believe that. One of the areas I focused on was our extended school year program. And I'm very proud of the trajectory of that program, particularly since I became the director. At the time I became the director, that program had been moved to this building, the Nichols Middle School. And it's a wonderful program, but it serves a primarily elementary population. And it was wildly unpopular with our families that it was here. So I consulted with our CPAC, and I moved that program back to the Early Childhood Center at MEC. That did not solve all my concerns. We did not have a consistent coordinator of the ESY program. It had been something that the special ed coordinators sort of filled in and took on extra work. But because it was an additional piece, you were getting tired people trying to get this program up and running. So I sought to hire a formal coordinator outside of our team who had fresh eyes and, frankly, fresh legs. And I found that. I found that within our staff. Trish Ferretti's been our coordinator for the past several years. And if you talk to people who go to the ESY program, they'll talk to you about the improvement. One of the things I just did was complete an extended school year program evaluation. Actually, Mr. Oakley, if you remember, I was talking about this in the summertime, and I promised you I would come back to talk about it. And I will, but not tonight. What is so amazing is that what we're doing now with that program is pretty cutting edge. And I can't wait to come back and really give you all the details, but what we're going to be doing is using that time differently for our older students. We're going to be tapping into facilities and experiences that are specific to secondary. We're going to be reviving the peer mentor program, which is something that, not the peer mentor program, the high school intern program that went away during COVID. And we're going to be infusing enrichment opportunities into this program. Why I'm so proud about that particular initiative is because, for one, it took a degree of vulnerability and humility to look at something and say, this is good, but how do we make it better? It took research and effort to figure out, well, how do we fix that? And then most of all, this evaluation wasn't me sitting in an office deciding. I surveyed all of our staff who work in the program. I surveyed all the parents who were in the program. I asked them all sorts of questions. I got a response rate on those surveys higher than most of the surveys we released in the COVID era. People were happy to tell me what they thought. And I think that when you solicit that feedback, what you end up with is something that's extremely calibrated to the needs of students. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
So I'd like to know how you handle interpersonal conflict now and how you feel like that might change if you are selected as superintendent.
Great question. I've actually had this experience before in this district where I've been a peer, and then I was promoted and I had to be someone's boss. So let me start by answering the first question. How I handle conflict is fairly directly. I'm not someone who hides from it, but it doesn't go away by passive aggressive or saying things you don't mean. I'm pretty good at sitting someone down, having the tough conversation. And I've had wonderful experiences in this district with people meeting me there. So I would say I'm direct, but I'm also predictable, which is helpful, because if you're navigating a conflict and you're not sure what the other person's going to do, it creates a degree of stress. But I want to go back to that other point, because I think that's a critical point in your question, which is, how does that change? Because when you're someone's peer and then you become their boss, it's very different. It does shift the dynamic. I had that, as I said, I had that experience. And I spoke with my team very openly about that. I've actually already spoken with my team in the event that this does happen. I wanted to talk to them. I wanted to know what they thought. I've spoken with all of the principals, all of the directors. And what I can tell you is conflict comes with the job. And I think my team knows that I will push them. I will make them uncomfortable because I'm not doing my job if I don't do that. But what I will promise them is what I would tell you tonight. I always try to be as respectful as I can. And I'm proud to tell you that I've had plenty of an argument with most of my team. And I have relationships that are still solid and on firm ground despite that. Sure.
Can you talk about your plan for supporting special ed staff? That was in one of your references, and they talked about how you came up with some plans to support paras, bus drivers, all of our support staff that go along with that. So can you elaborate a little bit?
So hold on, can you ask the second part of that question? You were asking about how I'll manage special education, like what's going to happen with special education?
You had talked about providing some extra training or to support our support staff in special ed. So can you just talk about that and elaborate on what you've done in the past and what you want to do in the future?
Sure. I'll just talk about paras for a moment. There's been a lot of different things that I've worked on. One of the things has been an annual orientation. You know, Dr. Gates and I worked together on the mentoring and induction program for a long time together. And it's a wonderful program that you welcome new teachers in, you have an opportunity to learn along with them, teach them about our community, and get them ready for the year. I designed this process for paraprofessionals. I've also really cultivated a practice of planning for paraprofessionals with a mind of what it is they do. Oftentimes, paraprofessionals are a bit of an afterthought, and that's unfortunate because they are a really important part of special education. They are our first line. Before COVID, one of the things we'd been working on was a strategy. We were using the video Intelligent Minds, which was something that Russell Johnston at DESE had widely lauded. It was a video of 4 vignettes, which is wonderful. But what we were really getting at was how we're helping paraprofessionals embed and instill in students independent skills. When you work with a student one-on-one, you foster this beautiful relationship with them. But sometimes it can be hard to detach, particularly if you are a devoted one-to-one ratio. You only work with that student, you know. It can be hard to not do for them. It's a very natural occurrence. But what we had to train our paras and talk to our paras about was the fact that our students will leave us. And if we aren't helping them become as independent as possible when they leave us, we're creating a disservice. I'm sure you two in particular both know that when you exit K-12 education and you enter adult service, it is very different. And we've had to learn that lesson the hard way. In fact, not to go back to the ESY program evaluation, but I have to, because one of our sitting paras is going to be a huge piece of how we tie in the transition into adult service. Because not only was she a parent, but she and I worked together. I was the coordinator. I was the special education team facilitator. And together we kind of took a journey on how we could improve that and make that information more accessible. So one of the ways I've addressed that is to kind of put myself in the shoes of who's doing what job and tailor professional development for them. Did you ask me a second piece about special ed going forward?
Yeah.
Okay. And that was something I didn't touch on, and I don't know why I did that last night as well. I do have a plan, because it's impossible for me to take this next step and not be very concerned about the Pupil Personnel Services Department, and in particular, special education. My vision would be to split the department and create 2 separate roles. I would restore a director of special education with a singular focus for special ed. Because just like all the other points I laid out, special education needs a devoted technician, someone who is going to come in with a high level of expertise and be able to laser focus on all areas. I'm talking about pre-K all the way through our postgraduate program. Somebody who's had a variety of experiences, somebody who knows how to train our staff and make them better special education teachers. These are things that, in the last 2 years, we really haven't had time to focus on. One of the things that we did last year, we have a really wonderful co-teach training. We used to work with a district consultant, Dr. Deborah Harris, and one of the cost savings mechanisms I used was to build capacity and create trainers in our district so that we could move on from her training and not have to pay for a consultant year after year. Kim Redlawn and Jennifer Healy are our trainers. And that training is not just for special education, but they're general education teacher co-teach pairs. And it's some of the most rich training we offer. Last year, because of everything, we presented it in a virtual context. And it did not, it was still wonderful, but it was not the way anybody wants it to be. So we'll be restoring that. So co-teach, for example, is an initiative, it's called the RISE training, but I won't go into all the acronyms. It's an initiative that needs to be reinvigorated, which we're only going to be able to accomplish if special ed gets its own focus. The rest of the duties, I think, get brought into a student services role. The rest of those duties also create a different lens in order to focus on those tasks more comprehensively. So that's how I would manage that. That's the vision that I would see going forward.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So you mentioned the equity. And so I'd like to hear a little bit about your experience with the LGBTQ population. And also this topic of gender-neutral bathrooms is big, kind of coming up a lot.
Sure.
In different circles. So I was just wondering if you could talk about LGBTQ in general, the equity walk, I'd like to hear more about that, and then specifically on gender-neutral bathrooms, how you feel it is now, and then do you have any plans for the future?
Sure. I'm going to start by telling you that I'm an ally, and I have been my whole life. I think that this is an issue that is steeped in law and compliance. When you look at not just Massachusetts law, but DESE regulations and what they expect us to create safe schools and safe spaces. So a short answer on gender bathrooms or gender neutral bathrooms is that that's an initiative when they come and do that coordinated, now tiered focus monitoring. I promise I'm going to stop tripping over those words. When they come in and do that walk, they're actually looking for initiatives like that. They're asking us, how are you assisting this population? And the really cool part about Middleborough is that since I've set foot in the district, I find this district to be very welcoming. I've seen students from all walks of life be welcomed in all spaces. I've worked with the advisor for our GSAs. These are people I know. And what I can tell you is that, there's a lot of work that is not just compliance-driven, but necessary in order to make our educational services accessible to them. If a student is managing, an issue of gender identity or sexual orientation or whatever have you, that gets in the way of their access to calculus or French or Russian or whatever it is they're studying. And so while we don't perseverate on it and make it the central point, what we do is try to create plans that make sense for them. How are they navigating this, especially as someone who's young, right? When you're young, you have a lot of questions about a lot of things. The last thing I would say a kid needs is, additional judgment from adults that work in a school. So what I would say and how I see that growing is really community outreach and education and discussion about what we do and what we don't do, right? I think it's important to talk about the fact that, there is no affirmative instruction in this area, but there is an effort to make sure that everything is accessible. So that's actually a big part of our procedures and policies subcommittee, which I am on, along with a school counselor at the high school. And actually that school counselor has been working on procedures a lot more often than I have. They've contacted me a couple of times about already hitting the ground running. I can also share that this is work that's been going on for some time, not just at the high school, but at the middle school. The middle school, under Heidi Latender this year, engaged in a training in order to help our staff better understand these issues. And that's probably the biggest area I see in the future is how are we helping people navigate these issues? I don't think we have to have the answers, but I think any educational institution should try to figure it out.
I would imagine that your role, or rather your department's role, as both the gateway to accommodations, but also the shepherd of district or taxpayer money, compared to what is legally required, is probably an extremely difficult line to walk. And I was wondering if you could talk about one of the more difficult situations you've encountered with providing accommodations or adhering to the law, and how did you deal with that?
Thank you for that question. It's actually going to be hard for me to pin it down, but I'll do my best. I say this to the coordinators all the time. I firmly believe it's the hardest job in the district. When you are talking to parents about children, particularly children with additional education needs, there is no more sacred moment in that parent's life than that time. Oftentimes they're dealing with grief, they're scared, and they're not sure what to do. So when you are put in a position where you have to somehow manage to figure out what you're going to be doing with this student, and you're also a gatekeeper of sorts for this district, and you're navigating, not for nothing, but a less than clear standard that what is free and appropriate public education. I'm proud to tell you this is something that this department has learned to navigate really well. And I'll give you an example because there's a parent who actually emailed me just earlier today. I'm most proud of this relationship because I have gone to meetings with this parent and we have disagreed very strenuously. And there have been times where you have to assert what you believe to be the standard, and it is not uncommon for a parent to disagree. I've never held that against a parent. I wouldn't hold it ever against any parent because they're advocating for their child, and that makes perfect sense to me. But oftentimes, the relationship gets very damaged, and sometimes we end up in litigation. That has not happened. And in this particular case, this particular parent and I have even said to each other, we don't always agree with each other, but we understand where they come from. And I think that that's the biggest win. When you can get to a place with someone, first of all, that means you've actually invested some time in that relationship. But it also means that I didn't present the information in a way that that parent felt judged or shamed or that their child wasn't a priority. So I obviously can't talk specifics, but that's probably, that is but one example. What I can tell you is at one point, all I was doing was, the majority of my time was spent in team meetings. So there would be weeks when I would have 6 or 7 contentious meetings a week. And, parents, when they're grieving, can be angry and upset, and I understand that. But it is difficult, and yet it's still a job to do. Sure.
These questions here dealt with conflict, and I'm going to ask a question about conflict in a different way. How, as superintendent, would you handle a conflict you had with a school committee member?
So, sorry, can you say that again?
A school committee member has an issue or something with you, and how would you deal with it?
Oh, great, yeah, right. What happens if there's a disagreement between the school committee and me? Well, first things first, the superintendent has a healthy sum of obligations under that role. But the school committee also has its own role. So the first thing I would do is make sure there was clear understanding. What are your roles? What are my roles? Some of you have been on the school committee for a long time. You're very knowledgeable in this area. You're going to be teaching me plenty. Some of you are new and could probably benefit from learning a little bit about what the role is. You're in luck because I would be learning too. The best way to handle conflict is to sit down and speak to each other. And that will always be the way I will tackle it. I am someone that would welcome a conversation, even a heated conversation, if it means we can get to the root of the problem. What I won't do is fester, stew, or avoid, because that doesn't help the 3,100 in this district, and it doesn't solve our problem. I'm a very solutions-oriented person, and the longer you work with me, the more you'll see that in me. I also can't help it, but I like to persuade. This is something that I have learned as a skill, and I have had trouble shedding it. I tend to be passionate about what I think, and I want to convince you. But you do get to a point in every argument where you're not going to get there, and I recognize that. But I'd be lying if I didn't tell you that my own team has told me that I am very persistent. So I do think that's part of me. I think it's part of my personality. But just like I've had fruitful conversation and disagreement with them, I think that disagreement with the school committee and the superintendent absolutely will happen. And if we're doing it right, we'll be able to get beyond it.
Zeke, I'll go back to you.
Clearly, you are very efficient. And you had talked about your 6 initiatives going forward. I was wondering, are you going to focus on just one at a time? Or will you be focusing on them all at the same? Because there's 2 different ways you could go with that. And then in addition to that, do you think you have a timeline for these initiatives?
Great questions. And it reminds me to talk about something else. Our strategic plan expires in 2022. So what you're really looking at is what I view as the major bones of our next strategic plan. Strategic plans are designed for really a 5-year period. And what I would say is, you know, I've laid out some pretty lofty positions. I want to be fair in my assessment. To me, and some initiatives are going to be ongoing for a long, long time. For example, I don't think equity work is something that we can do in a 5-year period, will be equitable, and we can move on. I don't really see that work in that capacity. I see that ongoing. But something like looking at data, I think in a 5-year period is doable to manage. I was thinking about, what goals I would focus on. And actually, let me turn to that. I was thinking about what goals I might focus on kind of right away. And when I talked about human resources, something I'd like to hit the ground running with is a procedure manual for human resources. And some of you are going to groan because you know how I like my manuals. But during my time in PPS, I did a 504 manual. I revamped along with teams. I did a special education procedure manual. I've done manuals for homeless. I assisted on the one for foster care. I know that was revamped again as well. But the reason I like procedures is because somebody gets to look up where they can find an answer. So I see that as a more immediate work. And I also see the cultivation of student voice as something that we can really hit the ground running. I would like to have students just very visible. I have talked with my leadership team about doing superintendent roundtable discussions. I think that the kids should know who I am. And not because I'm so wonderful, but because they should know that they're part of how we solve our problem. So I want them invested so that we can work together. So hopefully that answers your question.
It does, thank you.
Okay.
Tell me a little bit about your philosophy on delegating authority, and then from there, how do you maintain accountability?
Great question also. Delegating authority is essential to getting this work done. First of all, it's essential as part of being a superintendent. The superintendent is not, teaching a science class on any given basis. So I really look at my leadership team as being kind of the 5 long arms, the 5 buildings, plus Sarah Hickey in business, plus Dr. Markolitis in curriculum, plus Paula Magnasco in nursing. I have to be able to delegate and divide and conquer. I see the role of superintendent as someone who coordinates, who is informed, and oversees. And there are going to be initiatives I'm going to want to do, There are going to be things I'm going to be responsible. I won't be able to not, simply put. So that was the first part of your question. How would I delegate? And then there was the second part of your question.
Maintain accountability.
How would I maintain? All right, well, the way you maintain accountability in here is through the evaluation system. I'd want to sit down with my principals right away to talk about what goals they have. Not in a, I gotcha now, sort of, but what they want to see. What's their professional growth? I often would tell my special ed coordinators that it was my job to make them special education directors. And I feel that way about the rest of the leadership team. I'm only doing my job if I'm preparing them for the next step. So I want to work alongside them, as I said, not in a punitive way, but in order to develop them, because I think that's the role of the superintendent also. Sure.
Talk a little bit about your lack of experience in a classroom and how you would handle that with teachers that may see that as a deficit for you.
Sure. I would start by saying I've been navigating that for the past 10 years, so it's not new. And I would also argue that I have overseen all of special education with the same experience I carry today. And if it hasn't been an issue for the special education population, then I would argue it's not an issue, period, because certainly our special ed students are entitled to that of every other student in our district. I would also point out that I very much am an educator. And while I may not have taught science, I absolutely have experience in the classroom. And most importantly, I've been conferring knowledge and training since the day I walked in this district in 2007. So you have to think about what the superintendent does, right? Any superintendent does not come out of the classroom and become a superintendent. They're very far from classroom instruction by the time they get there. And I would be no different in that case. But I do think I could bring leadership to those who oversee teachers. And I think that's how I would navigate that. Sure.
So one of my big concerns for the schools is school safety. I know because of COVID, I think a lot of resources have been devoted to just that, and that's the way it just happened. But we do have the ALICE program here, and I'm just wondering what your experience with ALICE is, and how are your plans? Are you continuing that, or is there something else you're going to do for school safety?
School safety remains a top priority, whether we're talking COVID or otherwise. I mean, it is always a top priority. Safe schools are the first step. Okay. So I have experience. I've actually served on the DIRT Executive Committee, not recently, but Andy Dizell and I have worked together for years. He and I worked together when I was the special ed team facilitator at the Middleborough High School. So I've participated in all of the drills, including the year that I was pregnant and I couldn't get up off the floor because we were doing these lockdown drills, and we were in this classroom. You know, I've barricaded the doors in the Futures program. I've participated in these drills for several years. I'm very familiar with it. I don't see that as something I'm going to change. You asked specifically about ALICE. I don't see making radical changes, you know, to the work that Andy Dizell has led, I think, successfully for so long. But it's funny because Sarah Hickey and I happen to have been talking about DIRT earlier today. And Andy's on my list. He's someone I would sit down with and say, okay, let's recalibrate now that we can get back to kind of the traditional way of things. What do you see as needs? What do you see as areas of growth? And what continues to be your prevailing concern in school safety? I also see continuing and having, I think it's of critical importance that we maintain our relationship with the Middleborough Police Department. They are a tremendously supportive and professional organization. I've had experiences with them during times where I've covered the district when Superintendent Lynch has been out of town. And I don't know why, but when he's out of town, there tends to be something. It's just kind of been really helpful training for me in retrospect. But anytime there's been a need, you know, Joe Perkins and his team, Chief Perkins, excuse me, that they're there for our needs. And I absolutely, I'm a strong believer of when things are working well, you don't mess with them. And I see school safety as something that's working very well. I feel safe. I've always felt safe as an employee, and I think our kids feel safe too. And that's what matters to me.
mentioned earlier, and I liked the way you put it, that you're very protective of the use of public money. So I wanted to know, my mom lives in a town where there's a 2.5 override every year, just about. So I wanted to know that given the interaction between the community, the school committee, the budget, and the superintendent, obviously, if there was something that you felt very strongly about that would no doubt lead to an ask of additional money of the town, knowing the pressures that are on everyone, how would you navigate something like that?
It's a great question. Particularly because in the time that we're in right now, we are in a period where there's been additional grant money. But that time is going to end, and I'm very aware of that. So you have to brace, you have to prepare what's going to happen, if we have positions that we need to fund that we can't. So that's kind of the avenue where I'm already thinking, now why would I do that? Well, if I had positions that were directly serving students, that would be something that's important to me. So first things first, you are my consultative body. School committee is one of the first places, probably the first place I would go, along with leadership team. Because one of the things that has to be calibrated is that we need unity in what our priorities are, right? We have to take turns. Our principals are extremely persistent. They're wonderful advocates for their buildings, but we can't have all things at the same time. So there would have to be some degree of unity in what it was we were asking. The first step would be to go to school committee and discuss strategy for how we were going to navigate this. The next thing I would do is consider if there's any possible grant funding. Kevin Avitable emailed me just a couple of days ago, and he sent me a rundown of these grants that are all SEL based. He said, have you thought about this? And I'm like bursting with excitement. That is exactly the type of innovative thinking I was hoping I would get when I hired him. But that's another avenue. You have to figure out where the income stream is going to come from. And I'm pretty creative when it comes to that. If I need to, as I am in my home budget, if I need to buy something, you can go the traditional way of getting money from the same source, or you can try to earn it, or you can look to grants. One of the programs that I would love to see blossom within the special education department is our high school and post-grad program. And I do and would like to be able to offer tuition for other districts to tuition into those programs specifically, provided there is room and provided our students' needs are met, because our students take priority. But that's an example of something I would tap into. If I thought that we could create revenue, that revenue stream becomes a funding source for something else. And then the last piece would be to go to the town manager. And I expect to have regular dealings with the town manager. What concerns me about that is that the school department is one of many departments. And I understand that the town manager is going to have to navigate competing interests. Just as I would with my leadership team, I see it very similar. So that's kind of the loose outline of how I would address it. What I'll tell you is no one has a crystal ball. So there are off-ramps on kind of all of those avenues where that might fall off. The last case scenario I would look at is looking within our existing pizza. What can we cut out in order to fund it ourselves? But I will tell you, I don't always love doing that, because when you continue to cut the pizza, you are left with nothing at the end. You've cut it too much, right? So it's another avenue, but not my favorite avenue. Sure.
Can you talk to us about, if you get this position, your own personal work-life balance going forward?
Great question. It's something I've thought about. I've actually spent a lot of time over the last 2 weeks kind of intensely thinking about it. First things first, I am truly, truly blessed with the man I chose to marry. And I think the key to work-life balance is setting yourself up for success. And I certainly did that when I married him 15 years ago. So he's a huge component of my work-life balance. The other part of work-life balance is having the fortitude to know when to stop working. I will freely admit to you, this is an area of growth for me. During COVID, I did not do a good job of turning off. I was simply overwhelmed by the need The urgency of the situation made it tremendously difficult for me to ever really put it down. And when I was done at the end of my day, I found myself propping up others within the district because I just felt the need to help in a totally different way. In this position, I will absolutely enforce some internal rules for me. And the first one is proactive planning. I want to be a presence in the buildings, and I recognize that the more you do, the more time that's going to take up. But I do co-lead a household, and when you plan in advance, and you stick to your plan, you get pretty good at it. I'm also going to say something that I've long believed. Working parents are some of the most efficient employees you have. And that is because we're so used to having to deal with competing interests that those are the people that don't linger around the water cooler, so to speak. These are people who do what they have to do, get done what they have to get done, and then go home to their families. My family's going to be a huge part in my work-life balance. They are what brings me joy. So I see myself instituting procedures to help myself, and then affirmative stops. Now, I will say to you, in the role of superintendent, that's a very flexible wall, because if there is an issue, I would never want anyone to think that I wouldn't come running. Because the simple truth is, if the phone rings, it has to be answered. And I'm prepared to embark on that journey. I would say that the last 2 years has prepared me for taking on that role, and it wasn't until then that I thought, you know what, I can do this. So hopefully that answers your question.
It does, thank you. Z?
This will be my last question. And perhaps this is a question from a naive and new committee member. But this is the chance to brag about yourself a little bit, so I'm kind of... so what quality or characteristic about yourself, or what is a quality and characteristic about yourself that you are most proud of? Why? And how do you think that's going to help as a superintendent?
I think I handle pressure really well. I think that it's really hard to knock me off my game. And if you've seen me in my presentation mode, you'll know that. But if you've worked alongside me, what the rest of the team will tell you is when the chips are down and they need to call someone, they call me. Because they know I'm going to be calm. And I think that that will bode very, very well for a superintendent in a community. Things are going to go wrong. Things are going to happen. In the worst case scenario, you have someone at the helm who's panicking and someone who really can't handle pressure. I've handled pressure my entire life, you know, ranging from experiences as a kid through sitting for a bar exam that I passed the first time I took it to, you know, handling emergencies here at school over the last 10 years. So I feel prepared, but I feel like that's my strength.
That you're from a different town, which is absolutely fine, but my question is sort of just wrapped around the work-life balance. At some point you have to go home, but there's obviously lots going on in the district after hours, whether it be sports events or just different events that, you know, I'd like to see how you feel about kind of like where that would put you. You know, you want to maintain that home connection, but also be a presence in the community.
Sure, sure. Well, and that's where the planning comes into play. The way I kind of saw that going down was sitting down my principals at the beginning of the year. They all do a year-long calendar. And then purposefully selecting the activities. Now, what that earnestly means is the on-the-fly thing will be harder for me, right? Because I take that promise seriously. If I say to my kids, I'm going to be home for dinner on this particular day, I'd like to be able to stick to it. But I think that if there is a commitment to a certain amount of events per week or a certain amount of events per month, that I'll achieve that visibility. And there are additional pieces too. You know, there's a lot of weekend activities that I see myself bringing my family to. You know, I don't see the two worlds as being something that can't, you know, join in the middle. But you are right to have that concern, and it's a concern I have for myself. What I can tell you is I've balanced it I've lived in the same community the entire 10 years I've been here. So I would say that I have been able to navigate it, but I fully recognize that as superintendent, it would take on a whole new meaning. Sure.
This kind of ties to that, but can you talk about some concerns you have if you were to get the position?
Great question. I think my biggest concern is the unpredictability of the job. If I've learned one thing in the last 2 years, it's that anything that can happen will happen. And that makes it harder to plan. And as you've now heard, I really like to plan. So I think the unpredictability of what awaits, you know, we are in this sort of tenuous time where we're coming out of this period, hopefully a return to kind of a dawn of a new era. And there's a bit of me that wonders, is that going to happen? Are we good? Can we move forward? So I would say the uncertainty. And then I think the other major concern I really have is for my staff. I don't mean to sound dramatic about it, but I sense in them a degree of fatigue that I am really hopeful we can reinvigorate. But I'd be lying if I didn't say I wasn't worried about it. And I don't think it's specific to education. If you've kind of read the articles about the Great Resignation, I think a lot of people are sort of asking those large questions. Is this the thing I want to do? And in a lot of ways, I'm no different. I sort of went the other way with it, but you know, a lot of people are kind of doing that right now. And you can't run a school without people. So that's probably another big concern of mine.
Thank you.
Sure.
So there's been a lot of talk around wide-ranging discussions about the curriculum and parent involvement in the process of curriculum selection. What degree do you think the community should be involved in community curriculum development, and how would you approach changing it?
Good question. I do think that that's a question that's going to hopefully be somewhat answered by Dr. Markolitis, because one, she is the person who's going to be leading us into the future with this work. But two, you know, I'm a believer that parents should have a say, really, on anything going on. I kind of view this industry as customer service related a bit, right? I mean, I want our customers should be happy. Those are our students and our families. So I see families certainly involved in weighing in about curriculum. But I do see our curriculum director and our larger administrative team as responsible for selecting the curriculum ultimately. They're the ones with the training. They're the ones who are going to be carrying it out and having the professional development and teaching it, you know, down to our students. So I don't want to sound as though there isn't room for parent involvement, but I also don't want to overstate the role. I would view them as a consultative body, not necessarily a decision-making body.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
So, could you tell me how many employees you directly supervise now? And from your understanding of the current structures, how many employees you would directly supervise as the superintendent, approximately, not looking for exact numbers?
Sure. Yeah, you know what? I should have done this research and had this answer better. I don't have the actual number. Right now, I'd give you a ballpark.
Yeah.
I would put it in the neighborhood of 12. And as superintendent, I would see that ballooning to closer to 16, 17. I don't actually think it's that different. And I'm talking strictly about evaluation right now.
Yep.
When you're talking about oversight of staff, you know, my oversight of staff has been pretty expansive all along. And as I mentioned earlier, every time Superintendent Lynch leaves the district, it's all me anyway. And he doesn't leave that frequently. But when he does, that falls to me. So I don't see the role being all that more tedious in terms of the additional oversight. But I do think the work shifts. It is different when you're overseeing administration at a building-based level than it is a principal of a building. That's not only a tremendous honor, but it's also a tremendous responsibility. So I take that very seriously.
Thank you.
Sure.
Can you talk a little about technology and education, and in particular, what you would look at when purchasing new technology, be it apps, programs, or merchandise?
Yeah, well, for starters, there needs to be a plan. So the thing about technology, which is wonderful, is that it goes obsolete. And a lot of technology doesn't last that long. So my first question, because I'm fiscally frugal, is I'm gonna wanna know if we buy this thing, how long is this thing going to be current? And then what's our plan for continuing to fund the thing as it needs to be replaced? Certain technology is inexpensive and easy to replace. PPS has long used iPads. iPads have really ballooned in their ability to meet assistive technology needs for students. And it's low cost, which is great. If you kind of think of the old Dynavox, some of these older machines, which were not just massive, but really, really expensive. The iPad has revolutionized sort of that process. When I'm looking at software and I'm looking at technology, the first thing I'd be looking for is a plan. The second thing I would be looking for is efficacy with students. Tools are great. I have no problem with technology, but it needs to be integrated into our learning. I don't see technology as something our students passively learn on, right? It's not the thing that you set up and they watch while we eat our dinner. Technology should be fully integrated and complementing the curriculum that we're already using. So in terms of selection, my questions are going to focus on, well, who already uses this? How does it work there? How do you incorporate it into your instruction? And then most of all, do the students like it? That's the other part of technology. It's great. Sometimes, I don't know if you've had this experience, but we think something's great. We think it's a great idea. And then you bring the child in, you talk to the child, and they think that idea is terrible. So I'd love to see beta testing with some of these pieces, because all the great ideas in the world don't work if the students don't think so. And if you've ever sat in a team meeting, you know that this is something that comes up quite a bit in our teams. As adults, we love to sit around a table and plan for the student, but it's way more effective when they're there telling us, I'm not going to do that thing. So I view technology as something that needs to be kind of road tested a bit with kids too. Sure.
You mentioned how much you currently do, which is quite extensive, and I know that you want to split that department. So my question would be regarding the budget. How do you see that sort of fitting into the current budget going forward, and how would you then support those new roles?
Sure. Well, so for starters, the PPS role is very large, and so the salary goes along with that. A director of special education would be a smaller salary. If you look at that director of student service sort of concept, what I'd be looking to do is create a new job description, but I'm hoping I would have internal candidates for that particular position, which would or could function as a cost savings mechanism. Because if that's the case, then you can subsume one role within the other. That may not happen, but if it does happen, then that would be one way to financially accomplish that goal. If I was not able to do that, because it is conceivable I would not be able to do that. The other thing I could do is look at my leadership team for the additional roles and divvy them up. Sometimes the superintendent actually retains certain roles. So that's something else that I would consider if I needed to as well, because I always see myself as part of the solution, not just the problem. But my hope is that it wouldn't actually be a tremendous additional financial burden for the district. That would be the goal.
Thank you.
Sure.
What do you think makes a good superintendent?
I think the best superintendents understand why we are here. And they never lose sight of the fact that it's about kids. It's not about ego. It's not about anything else. It's not about people. It's about students. We are an educational institution. It's something I've told my staff for years. Try to make the best decision for the student. Do that because it's always going to be defendable. Even if you make a mistake or you make the wrong decision, if you used the student as the guiding light for why you made the decision, you may have made a mistake, but you at least were well-intentioned. And I think that for superintendents, that should be their goal as well, I think sometimes superintendents trip up when they lose sight of it.
Thank you.
Sure.
So this next question, I'm going to try to put two together. I don't know if that's unfair. But, so I was impressed with Mr. Lynch, always met with all the candidates when they came in for hiring. He felt very strongly that he had to be there. What do you, when you're hiring a new employee, what is your role as superintendent? And also, well, I think more importantly, is if you had to let go of an employee, what was your approach?
Sure.
Okay.
It's funny you say that. I've actually told Superintendent Lynch that I like that about him too. I like it so much that I want to model it. I've heard it from staff that they really, really loved that the superintendent gave them some time. And it's just stuck with me as a practice that I think is a smart one. And I'm the first to tell you, I don't always have the best idea, but I like to steal the best idea for sure. So if someone's doing it, then I'm all for it. And I've heard it over the years. It doesn't matter what the job is. But I love that he does that, and it's something I would do. You asked a second part.
Yeah,
Would have to.
letting go of an employee.
I've had the unfortunate experience of doing that. And that's also an in-person meeting. You know, it's very similar. What I would do is what I've done up until this point, which is, you know, look that person in the eye and tell them the truth, and be as kind as possible on what amounts to somebody's worst day.
Thank you.
Sure.
Well said.
So in my job, and probably in all of our jobs, I think there is, sorry, I forgot. I wanted to preface this. So I am very conscious of the fact, I believe, that interviews in a large part are a performance of sorts. But I think in all of our jobs, there's evidence of, kind of irrefutable evidence of extra time spent and mentoring and, you know, initiatives. You've talked about initiatives. But I wondered if you could give an example of someone that you have spent extra time with and mentored and are proud to see what they have accomplished, as maybe not as a result, because that would be taking credit for their success, but someone that you've seen succeed under your mentorship.
Sure. The person that comes to mind is Jennifer Healy. So when I first came into the district, I was the special ed coordinator at the middle school. Well, my office was at the middle school. And Jennifer Healy was a brand new teacher, about across the hallway from where my office door was. And she was young and had been on the job a couple of years. And she was a really exciting and engaging teacher. I found myself in her class watching because I loved to watch her connection with kids. We sat down together at a team meeting because this was part of my role. And I saw something in her right away that spoke to me that she had possessed a certain degree of leadership skill and some knowledge far beyond her years. And not long after that, I approached Jen about what her future plans were. And I think I caught her off guard because she, I think, thought I was a little bit off base and wondering why I was asking her these questions. But what I was really asking is, what do you see in the future for yourself? And from that point in time, I've worked very closely with Jen. I've watched Jen and sort of kept my eye on Jen, and we meet pretty regularly. We talk all of the time. And it came as no surprise that when it came time for me to step into my PPS role, I remember Paul Brannigan sat me down and he said, "Now what?" Because I had cultivated a very close relationship with Paul, and understandably, he wanted to know who was going to fill my shoes. And I said, "Paul, I have the perfect candidate for you. I really do." And, you know, we posted, we, you know, had to see what was out there, and Jen rose to the top, unsurprisingly. And she stepped into that role as she became a mother for the first time. And I'm proud to tell you that when I left Middleborough High School, they didn't miss me. That is the sign of a leader. If something can function without you, you've done your job. And every time I've set a goal for Jen, Jen's shot way beyond that. And I can't wait to see what she'll do next because she really does hold a ton of promise. She's become a leader. She's become a trainer within our district. And she's become someone that people look up to. And I think that's leadership.
Thank you.
Sure.
Can you talk to me in becoming superintendent, what your role would be with our 6 unions?
Yeah, sure. So I'm currently on the negotiation, team, and we're in that process now. But the superintendent holds a very important relationship with all 6 unions in the sense that you have to have a relationship with all 6 unions. This is the crux of how you solve problems and how you navigate disputes. So I will be engaging with all 6 unions this year. And I had made that choice months ago because I knew that, that was something I wanted to know more about and wanted to have the specific experience of working with our particular unions. I'd also like to kind of point out that we're lucky. We're very lucky with our union leadership and the way our unions engage with us as a community. This is another thing that if you've paid attention to the news over the last couple of years, some communities have been at loggerheads and, really been unable to come to agreement. And I think that we're very fortunate that our unions have always worked alongside the administrative team. I see the superintendent as having an integral role in being connected to all 6 unions, meeting with all 6 unions, and being a source of support.
Thank you.
Sure.
This will be my final question. So regarding the behavior piece, you talked about, expanding that role and, but with the ever-growing mental health concerns, and we know that is just a huge piece right now.
Yeah.
But this district has been really strong in supporting that. So where you might be superintendent, how do you see this being an area you continue to support?
I think the biggest way to continue to support these initiatives is to continue to endorse the funding of those positions. The school committee has been amazing. I was talking about that when I was here before, that in a time when you've seen communities cut, this community has chosen to expand. And I think it's the superintendent's job to safeguard those roles, make sure they're not going away, and make sure those roles are being put to maximal use. If anything, I was talking with Josh Porter, the Director of Alternative Pathways, yesterday, and he was talking to me about an innovative concept where, we have wonderful, expansive clinical team for our students. Mm-hmm. He said, what do you think about staff? And a light bulb kind of went off because I thought that was a really great idea, When you're an employee and you're having an issue, our clinical staff is wonderful and they're very generous with their time, but they're busy. Mm-hmm. So I kind of saw that as a particular area of growth, but I think the most important thing the superintendent can do is continue to talk about the importance of supporting mental health in schools, make sure that you have community buy-in with that concept, and then make sure those positions stay in place.
Thank you.
Sure.
Can you talk a little bit about how you would advocate for Middleborough at the state level?
Sure. So I'm already part of organizations, within my role, and that also includes regular meetings with the ESE. I am proud to tell you I am always an outspoken representative in Middleborough. I always have been, and I always will be. So I see myself engaging with the ESE in the way I have as a director of pupil personnel services. I think that it's perfectly reasonable to ask questions, to ask clarity, and I'm proud to tell you I've developed positive relationships with them as well. One of the initiatives that we have to do every year, it's not really an initiative, one of the things we have to do every year is submit a circuit breaker file. And I used to hate, I would have to drive to these, you have to train every year because the file is very complicated. It's a little bit like learning calculus in the sense that it's a foreign language and you have to kind of review it before you do it each year. But I would have to drive to remote locations in order to get the training. So I made DESE offer the training sites here. Because one, we'd gone one-to-one as an initiative, so we had computer labs, which is where that happens, and they were available. And two, it was a way to kind of maximize. So that's one example of how I've advocated in the past, but I think that people know me to be outspoken, and that would continue.
Thank you.
Sure.
So I think this will be my final question for you, Ms. Lyons. And it has to do with the, you mentioned your notes here. one of your vision statements was the, student voice, but also for the community. How do you intend on staying in touch with the community, see what the interests are, and that student voice that you talked about?
That's a great question. I think one of the ways you stay in touch with the community is by attending events. There's a myriad of ways, whether you're engaging through the arts or the sports. There's, of course, school committee, but, it depends week to week and what the topic is, depending on interest. One of the practices I cultivated a couple of years ago was a Twitter presence. And I've been navigating my community that way. And not that I have like 1 million followers, because that's certainly not the case. But I think communication with our community is going to be something that they can rely upon with me. I tend to be someone who communicates a lot. I tend to be someone who explains my thinking. And I think that cultivating that practice of communication is one way to draw families in. If they can rely on hearing from me, and they know what I'm thinking, they may not always agree with what I'm thinking, but at least they'll understand, my rationale or my decision-making process, or minimally, they'll know me, which I think breaks down a barrier, right? I don't want to be this sort of faceless person that sits in an office. I'd like to be accessible to the community.
Thank you.
Sure.
So I wondered if you could talk about a professional mistake that you have made and how you made it right, because I don't think anyone's perfect.
No, and my goodness, I've made so many. I'm trying to decide what a good example of that would be. I can tell you early on in my role at PPS, grants were new to me. And I was somewhat threatened by the filing of grants and the drafting of grants. It just wasn't something I'd done. And the very first grant I filed, I submitted, and there was a mistake in the grant. And so when you're new at doing this, you're sure the world's going to end because you've made a mistake and you've sent it to the state, and of all the places to make a mistake, it's financial. Game over, packing my bags, moving out of the district, the whole nine. I'm happy to tell you, it's not that rigid a process. But what helped is that I identified the mistake right away, and I called the state right away. So I was able to quickly and efficiently repair the mistake. And there are truly many more, but I really think, as with all things, one of the most important lessons we model for our kids is this growth mindset that you learn through mistake. I'm happy to tell you I've never made that mistake again with a grant. Not that particular mistake, but I think that modeling for our kids that it's okay to make mistakes and that you learn when you do, and that the most important thing you can be in that time is honest, then I've modeled a skill I want to see in our kids.
Thanks.
Sure.
Carol, talk to us about where you see yourself in 5 years.
In 5 years, I hope to be sitting here in this seat. It's funny, when Mr. Lynch hired me, Superintendent Lynch hired me for PPS, he asked me the same question. And I told him that I had so much to accomplish, that I'd be lucky if I could accomplish that in 10 years. With this particular seat, I don't want to go anywhere else. There's nowhere else for me to go. So not only do I want to be sitting in this seat, but I want to be advancing in front of you a whole new plan with new ideas, fresh ideas, talking about the successes that we've had as a community. That's where I want to be, and I hope I get there.
So that was going to be my question, so I don't have any.
So I've spoken to, just like we all have, I'm sure, spoken to members of the community about you and about the superintendent search and about plans for the district and problems, potential problems. And two things I wondered if you could talk about. I'm trying Greg's trick to get you to answer two things at once. The first thing is around availability of substitute teachers and what it is that we can do to solve what it sounds like is a problem around that. And I don't think it's a Middleborough problem. I think it's probably a everywhere problem. But could you touch on that briefly? And then could you also talk about the level of support that you feel PPS is able to offer to the district? And is it enough? And are there vacancies? And if so, what are you going to do to solve that? So it sounds like kind of 10 questions, but is that okay? Yeah.
Let me start. Let me start with substitutes first, okay? You are right in the sense that that is very much not a, that is not a just Middleborough problem. You're seeing that everywhere. One of the things that I think we haven't tapped into, that I think we could tap into for substitutes, is partnering with local colleges like BSU. If it's one thing I've learned about college kids, it's that they occasionally have more time than us. And I think the key with substitutes is trying to tap into new areas for staffing. College kids are young, they're fresh, and a lot of them at BSU are learning to be teachers. So it would be attractive to create some type of system between our organizations, right? You scratch your back, I scratch mine. You know, that's something I've thought about. It is tempting to say, well, raise the pay of substitutes, you'll get more substitutes. I haven't kind of looked at that enough to affirmatively tell you I think this would solve the problem. It's certainly something I could look into and give you a better answer in the future. But the other thing I think we could do is really advertise in a different way. You know, how we advertise and how we hire people is something that we could review. In fact, Sarah Hickey and I were talking about the hiring packet. No, I'm sorry, it was Dr. Markolitis and I that were talking about the hiring packet just last week. And really looking at, are we casting our net, you know, as far as we can? Are we looking in all the crannies? Are we looking in all the places where people might be looking for work? So that's the other thing I might try. So that was the first part of the question.
And then PPS, current staffing levels, capabilities, is it enough? And if not, what would you do to?
Sure, sure.
Yeah.
Well, this question is hard for me because I have not really gone too far down the path of what, you know, how am I going to manage that, because I don't yet know the outcome of this process, right? So first things first, that yes, I have an open position, and yes, I have been unable to fill it. That is partly because the vacancy came open at the end of the calendar year. So I had a vacancy in January. I did have a pool of applicants. I did find an applicant. I advanced a finalist. I was ready to move, and that applicant backed out, not because of, it had nothing to do with Middleborough and nothing to do with us. Sometimes that does happen. I'm not concerned about filling that position because we are coming into hiring season. And I did have several candidates reach out to me that said, I would love to come and do this job, but I can't leave my community in January. And I'll be honest, when someone says that to me, I respect them even more. And that makes me want to hire them extra. So I have their names and phone numbers. Those are some of the first phone calls I'll make because I'm confident that I'll be able to reload, so to speak. The other part of your question is the current staffing level enough? And the truthful answer is I don't yet know. I want time to talk to my team and really explore that. You know, it really depends on what's going on. Is there a new PPS director? Is there, you know, like the reason I'm struggling to give you an affirmative answer is because it kind of depends on what happens here. I could certainly see a scenario where I want to increase. I could. And it depends is a terrible answer, but it honestly is the true answer here. What I can assure you is that it would be based on real numbers, on real research, in collaboration with not just the coordinators, but also my broader administrative team, my leadership team, because this is a team that has changed in size over the years. And so I know that, that they have opinions on it, rightfully so, and I would include them in the solution as I would for anything else. Sure.
Do you have other questions? Or
I do.
You do? Go ahead.
You want to keep going?
Okay, go ahead.
Okay,
You have another question?
So obviously the budget subcommittee worked with the superintendent and Sarah to create to pass a budget. You obviously were a part of that budget as well. I just wondered if you were the superintendent, would that budget that was just passed look the same?
Oh, great question. Yes, I think substantially so. I would work, I mean, that's one of the benefits of going with an internal candidate, is that I know exactly how disruptive it would be if I said, oh, by the way, I'm going to need, X amount of money that we don't possess. And while I certainly need to, as I was just talking to you about the coordinator scenario, that's something I would want to consider, but I don't see a substantial change. I was in the room for a lot of that design. I'm very familiar with the budget, or at least as familiar as the non-business manager can be, Director of Business and Finance, but I don't forecast significant change.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Is it okay? Yeah. I wondered if you have ever had a disagreement, doesn't have to be a specific person that you mentioned, but on the direction of the district with a stakeholder within the Middleborough Public Schools, and if so, how did you manage that situation and maintain the relationship?
So is the question about the direction of the district?
Nope.
Just
it's about-
any type of disagreement?
In my head, I'm imagining Brian Lynch wants to do X, you want to do Y. Have you disagreed on stuff, and how did you solve that disagreement?
Oh, yeah. Superintendent Lynch and I disagree quite a bit. And I think he still has an affinity for me despite that. Especially because Superintendent Lynch and I sit down very regularly to talk about special education and expenditures. And unsurprisingly, a lot of my asks come with money. So I know that there are times where I have asked for things, and he has said, you absolutely cannot, right? So are you asking for, like, what was the thing I asked for, or are you asking more about how did that get navigated?
Yeah, I think what I was looking for, and I didn't say it clearly, but is how did you make sure that you advocated as strongly as possible for that without, stepping over that line into, relationship ruined?
Yeah. Well, I mean, for starters, Superintendent Lynch is my supervisor, right? And I'm a chain of command person. I really am. So he'll tell you, I know his body language at this point. So I know when I'm approaching the place where he is done wanting to discuss something with me. And I think that using nonverbal communication and reading each other is a whole separate skill that is critical. You have to know when the person is either verbally or non-verbally telling you that they are approaching the end of a conversation. And I think I'm in tune with that. But what I'll say is, Brian and I have had disagreements on things where we've agreed to put it away and come back to it, and talk about it at a later time. It kind of depends. He and I are famous for this sort of north of 4 o'clock conversation. But a lot gets done at that hour, so it's hard to not have it. I don't know that I've really answered your question,
No,
but
I think what you just said about being able to put it away
Yeah.
and come back to it, I think that's kind of what I was looking for, and thank you, that's great.
sure.
Okay. Sorry, I apparently need glasses now. Okay. I think I am approaching the end of my list, but I did have one hidden in here somewhere that I really wanted to ask. No, actually, Meg asked that one, so I'm done. Yep. Thank you very much.
So,
Thank you.
my last question for you is this. As I look over the amount of questions we've asked you, because I kept a running list and then other people asked, is there a question we missed? Is there a question we should have asked that by you answering gives us some bit of information that's important to you? So I want to ask that.
I think you might have stumped me. I feel like I think I've answered a lot of questions. I can't tell you that I feel like you've learned a lot about me tonight. I think you've heard about my why. I think you've heard about my work. And I think you've learned a little bit about what kind of makes me tick. So I wouldn't offer anything else.
Is there anything you want to say to wrap up?
Well, I wanted to thank everybody for their time and the thoughtful questions and the depth of questions. It's a testament to the community to really vet people who work in our district. And what I would say is that, something I heard earlier tonight is that when you interview, there's a degree of performance. And I've had that experience as someone who hires. You know, you think you know someone, they manage the interview a certain way, and then they come on the scene, and maybe it matches, maybe it doesn't. The good news for you is that you all know exactly how I perform. You've had a track record with me longer than most applicants. So what I would ask is that, you know, you look at that record and ask if that's what's right for this community at this time. I've spent a lot of time telling you that I think that I'm right, and I'm right now, but I think you have to ask yourself the same question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We appreciate the time. And with that, I'm going to take a brief 5-minute recess, and then we'll come back, okay? Thank you. Thank you. I'm gonna reconvene the meeting. So at this time, what I'm gonna ask everyone to do is this. I'm just gonna call on you. You can say whatever you want about what we've heard from tonight, anything you'd like to say, and then I will, after everyone has had an opportunity, we'll move to next steps, okay? So Zeke, I'm gonna start with you, because you're at the end of the table.
Yeah, hot seat. All right. I think what we heard tonight was pretty good. This was great. I've never been in the position before where I've needed to hire a candidate before, and so this was a great learning experience. But I wonder if, because this is my first time doing this, I don't have a lot of experience in terms of a reference to judge this on. So I guess my question is there anyone else that we could look at, even for a brief amount of time? I don't know what the process might be at all. Is there somehow someone out there that we could also get to interview? That way we at least have, I guess you could say a bigger pool, but I mean, it's really only one other person. And that way we can see, we can measure up. Because I think Carolyn blew it out of the park tonight. I really believe that. But I also wonder, you know, if there is someone else that could also do that. That's my 2 cents.
Thank you. Teresa?
This is conflicting for me. Coming into this process, again, I've never done this before, but I've been a parent in this district for 15 years. So I've very much been looking forward to an opportunity at some point in my lifetime, which I'm proud to be here and be part of it. But it's something I take extremely seriously, and it's come with a lot of internal struggle for me in the last couple of weeks. Because I feel that I was voted into this seat to be a voice for the community, and that's something I do take seriously, and I want to make sure that people feel heard. But my biggest concern, and truly, Ms. Lyons, this is really, it comes down to being about you in a lot more ways than I think maybe you aren't sure of. I want you to shine. So I've had many experiences with you, and I want to make sure that the community knows you to be the person that I have seen from you to be. And my concern is that when people have this reservation, you only interviewed one person, and we go forward with that one person, that's sort of going to be hanging over you a little bit, and I don't want that for you. So that's my conflict, because you did shine. You did exactly what I would have expected you to do. I thought you were tremendous this evening, but I have to weigh that. So I feel like I'm sort of on that same path of, can we look at one or two other people? And it's not because I don't want you to be that final candidate. It's more because I do, but I want everyone on board, and I want everyone to feel really confident about that, and that the decision that we made was in the best interest of this district, and that we really just exhausted all avenues, and that we still said, she's our girl. So that's where I'm at.
I want to kind of echo, I guess. So similarly to Teresa, I look at this position as something that I'm elected to do, and to listen to both sides and to hear everybody within the community and come to a decision that is separate of my thoughts, my feelings, because that's not why I'm in this role. So for me, I don't think we're going to find somebody better. I really don't. I think you hit every nail on the head. I think the fact that you're here already, you've been here, you know our system, you know our people, you know our kids, you know a good chunk of our parents. You have so much working for you, but to take you on as our superintendent and not see you against anyone else, we're doing you a disservice. And all we're doing is setting you up for failure. And I don't want to set you up for failure. I want you to be successful. So I share those same concerns about not interviewing anyone else. And I've never done this before either. So this was a great learning process for me to be able to see how the interview format worked, what types of questions we were asking, what kind of answers I wanted to hear, answers I didn't know I wanted to hear but then heard. So I think we need to kind of look at like Zeke and Teresa said, one or two other people.
Great.
So, the way I feel, first of all, I was impressed with Carolyn, her experience, knowledge, and I want to say presence, because I felt like I got to know the person in front of me tonight. I know that she's had a long week. She's had public Q&A last night. She had the meeting with staff. The week before that, she was meeting with town departments. So this is a gauntlet. A lot of people, if you can imagine interviewing for a job, right, how nervous you are sitting in a room with one other person. But now put yourself in a room with 6 interviewers and have it being broadcast on live TV. It's a tremendous amount of pressure, and I do think Carolyn did a great job. I just want to talk about this idea of one candidate. I am actually going to disagree with my previous 3 committee members. We had 6 qualified candidates in our school system. And when we first embarked on this process, Mr. Young, who has been through the hiring process a few times, and Mr. Lynch, who has been 40 years in his profession, both said to us, the committee, without reservation, we have people in our district that will be great superintendents. And they said that in the plural. And I believe them because I happen to know and work with those people as well. So I think we are in the enviable state of having a lot of internal people. Now, yes, only one person came forward to apply. And I do realize the optics of that in the public seem like, oh, we handpicked our superintendent. No, that was not the case. In fact, when we sat down, we knew the 6 people that were qualified, and there's probably more in the district that we don't know about that have the licensure. But we knew at least 6, and I was expecting 2 or 3 people to apply and have a robust system. But Carolyn was the one that came forward. The other people, for their own reasons, decided not to apply. Okay. I also want to say, so I don't look at it as one candidate. I look at it as we had 6 candidates, and this is the one that applied. Also, superintendents serve at the discretion of the school committee. It's our most important job, but it's a job that we have all year long. This isn't a decision that we're making for the district for the next 5 or 6 years. Every year, the superintendent sits in the meetings with school committee, and they have to go through an evaluation process every year. And that, like a hiring process in public, the superintendent is also, I think, under a lot of pressure to be evaluated in public. They have to sit at the table and listen to their evaluation being broadcast to a live public audience. I think Carolyn showed me a lot today. So I want to finish up with saying that the question I got a lot this week, and there's been, hey, I am thrilled. People may not believe this. It's been a tough year being on school committee. It really has. We've had a lot of people coming at us with a lot of different views. But I will say this level of community engagement is good. And I'm not saying my decision tonight's not going against community engagement. But I had the question a few times, how can you be sure you have the best person for the job by the only interviewing one candidate? That was the question posed to me. After tonight, my true feeling is this is how. I sat here and watched an extraordinary candidate sit in front of us. Okay, so after tonight, I am very much convinced that Carolyn is the best person for the job. Sometimes things work out. Sometimes you get the right person. Now, there are other districts looking for superintendents. I would not be surprised to see some other people from our district going out for those jobs, okay? So I believe that we have had a robust process. I am sure that she will make a great superintendent. So I am actually not concerned about the one candidate issue. Thank you.
I have been flopping around on this in my head for ever since we heard that Superintendent Lynch was going to retire. And even more extreme, just struggling with how to make the best choice for this school district in one of kind of the two major ways that school committees influence these things. I very much struggle with the question of single candidate. However, I have up until 7:05 when this began, I was very much of the mind that I think I would like to push for some additional candidates. However, that changed listening to Carolyn speak, and I very much appreciated what Mr. Stevens said about his rationale behind the single candidate. And what I would say is I've taken the time to watch superintendent interviews locally that just happened. And I think that if we were to put for instance, I watched a bunch in Hingham. If we were to put the Hingham Public Schools superintendent interviews right next to Carolyn Lyons' superintendent interview, I think it would be very obvious that we have something really special. And what I really wanted to push is because I have talked to a lot of people about my feelings on this. I've reached out to people I know who teach in the district. I've reached out to people I know who work in other capacities in the district. I've reached out to parents. I've even reached out to parents that I specifically knew had difficulty advocating for their children through the PPS department. And I have heard nothing but incredible things. And then I wanted to make one more point, is that we all have experiences in our jobs, I think, that make us in some way or another qualified to assess a candidate. Doesn't mean that I have had to work in a school system. It means that I regularly interact with the chief scientific officer and the CEO and the president of my current company. It means that I am a member of leadership in my current company. I know how to see someone that will create and move things forward because I've seen it, and I'm learning how to be it. And I am blown away by the Q&A that I watched last night, all the presentations that I've ever seen Carolyn give, and this tonight was really just the total icing on the cake. And we're being televised, so just a message to those that asked me if we would expand this search. I worry that if we do that, we might lose the brightest shining star, I think, in the district, and I think we might lose the next 2 to 3, 4 years, like Carolyn outlined here, by losing the progress, the relationships, and the plan that Carolyn has. And so I want to be clear, I am not saying that right now I am ready to extend an offer, and this is where I need help from Chair Young. I took a ton of notes on what you said. I would like to watch this interview over and over again, and I would like to, if the chair and the committee agrees, return to this next week. Those are my feelings.
So I would say a couple things. Normally, the school committee makes a decision right after they have the candidate. There's some backing for that. But I do want to say a couple of things first, so I want to give my piece, if that's okay. First and foremost is this, with all due respect to Carolyn, I didn't want to be here tonight, and I don't think anyone else did. And I don't think she did, and I don't think the administrator is here. And the reason is because Brian's leaving. Just to be clear, the committee charged me in September to negotiate a contract, an extension to the contract with Brian. Brian and I had tried to work on that. We were going back and forth and having a really good time doing it, but then he just decided it was time. And I respect that. And so I'll miss Brian. Having been here, I will also tell everybody the same thing, which is when Brian was selected, I heard lots of different things from the community about he's only a principal. He doesn't have a doctorate. I mean, I can go on and on and on with all this sort of things. But what it boiled down to me is probably, I've been a school committee member now in my 14th year between two communities. It was a discussion I had with a young lady at the high school when we were in the middle of the process. And she came up to me and she said, Mr. Young, don't choose a superintendent who wants to be a superintendent. Choose a superintendent who wants to be Middleborough superintendent. Those are powerful words to me and resonated. And when you saw Brian's interview that night, it became very clear he wanted to be Middleborough superintendent. One of the things that I do when candidates come at times for superintendent, I really fundamentally look at one thing. Lots of people can talk the superintendent talk and speak the superintendent speak, but how do they tailor it to Middleborough? What did they do to look at the pieces and say, this is how what I would implement in Middleborough? And so, you know, I've seen the other, you know, I've seen other candidates, Rich, I know you put out some. I spend a lot of time when I'm out at MASC events and especially the convention talking to people. I have a lot of friends who are school committee members who I've made relationships with over that time. I also feel really good about I have lots of relationships with other superintendents. I agree with you, Rich. What happens is that there are more and more vacancies coming up. People are getting out of the system. But this is extraordinarily unique. First and foremost, this is the person Brian put in charge of the system when he's away. Okay? So when assessing other superintendents, the first assessment you make is with Brian, because that's the superintendent we all know. And then in addition, several of you are teachers and aides and have worked for other superintendents. I know for a fact, and I'm not going to point out who, some of you have worked for bad superintendents. And if they ever applied here, you know, their resume would go in the receptacle because we know they're bad superintendents, right? Some of you work for good superintendents and have good relationships. And so I've seen it, I've witnessed it, I've been a part of it. I've also been to conferences with some of you where we sit there and we listen for hours to other school committee members talking to us about this happened, that happened, and we chuckle because we're like, that's not what happened. And Greg and I had to sit down with a local school committee and have a fundamental conversation about what the role and responsibility with budget was. And to the point they were like, no, the superintendent gave us the budget and told us we had to pass it. And I was like, no, it doesn't have to be that way. And they went back to their community and changed it. So I get it. I really do. I think the points that resonate for me more than anything else is this. You are not going to find an outside candidate who comes in and is able to do anything in the first year. You're not going to find an outside candidate who is able to draft an entry plan the moment they arrive. You're going to have to wait. You're going to have to wait for them to assess the community. That doesn't happen here. If Caroline's chosen, she starts on the ground. The other piece that is huge is you're going to have somebody, if you wait to have somebody come in, they're clearly not part of the budget process. They're clearly not part of the negotiating process. They're clearly not part of the wrapping up process with the superintendent. That doesn't happen. And there's a gap there too. This is an opportunity to have a candidate that I think clearly you can see is extraordinarily qualified to hold the position and does a couple of other things. First, it gives her time to work with current administration and make the transition as smooth as possible, smooth than it would ever be otherwise. It gives her time to immediately begin looking at her position and other positions of what she can do and how she can start. It also gives an easier transition for the end with sort of Brian and walking out. I believe in opportunities. I really do. I believe every once in a while opportunities arise and the stars align that makes sense. I don't believe in hoping to see something. I mean, everything you've told me is she did a fantastic job here. She'd make a fantastic superintendent. But I'd like to see somebody else do poorly so I know she's best. Right? I mean, that's what I'm hearing. I'd like to see somebody else show me that she's the best. When you sat here and realized she answered, like, go through those questions. I saw the way you react. I see the way you answer. She answers the way we want Middleborough to be. And the reason is because she understands Middleborough more so than anyone else who's going to come here or be a part of it. And that's the piece, and that's the opportunity that gives us a chance. Now, I will admit that I really wish, as Greg said, there were 6 other people, there's 5 other people who all have the ability to be superintendent. They all have the licensure, right? When Brian told me he was not going to be doing it, 5 seconds later, we had a conversation with Sarah, and the first thing Sarah said to me is, I'm out. I'm not doing it. And I know Sarah held the license because we had the conversation. I fundamentally believe, really, in the staff we have. And I've said that over and over again, and I can't say it enough. I will also tell each and every one of you, as we sit here, this is not unique to tonight. We've sat here and done this a lot. We moved internally somebody to be the principal of this building. We moved internally for somebody to be principal of the MEC. We moved internally for somebody to be the PPS director and director of SPED. We moved internally for assistant principal positions. And the reason why is because we had quality staff to do it, and it made sense for our community. I agree with everybody at this table that I wish things were different, okay? But again, I also fundamentally believe that when an opportunity arises, that you take the opportunity, you grab it, and you feel good about it. I'm not hearing anybody tell me, not a single person, if we make Caroline superintendent, it's making her superintendent is gonna make us feel bad. What we're saying is, I just wanted to see somebody else. Opportunities here, opportunities in front of us. This would be the best step for Middleborough. And I can't emphasize enough, take it tonight and accept it. And you'll feel great about yourself while you're sitting in those roles. And you guys all know, this is sort of my final run. I ran one time, I have 2 years left. I fundamentally believe that my time, will be over in 2 years because my kids are out of school. I want other people to become involved in the school system and be part of it. I'd like you guys to be around. I know Greg's not gonna be. I think you guys do a really good job. I get that you haven't been through this process before. But I will tell you this, I've done it a lot. Like I told you, my last time in Avon, what we had done was we took this current superintendent, we had a great candidate who made sense. We put in her contract that she would be superintendent after the superintendent resigned. She did it. She was in Avon for another 12 years. She was a great candidate. And as a matter of fact, does some of the superintendent searches right now. I've been doing this for a while, and I get that I wish we had more candidates. But as each and every one of you get, the best candidate came out tonight. It's not about how many candidates you have. It's do you have the right person to be the superintendent of Middleborough, and not that they want to be superintendent, but they want to be superintendent of Middleborough. So thank you for listening. I really implore you do not walk away from an opportunity that I really feel that you'll regret later on. And I don't say that lightly, and I don't say that any other way, but again, I know how much you all appreciate Brian and think Brian's a good superintendent. And to me, that piece is, this is the person he entrusts with the district when he's out. And Brian's not going to choose sides here, and it's not a superintendent place. I've worked with this lady a lot. She's by far and away the best PPS director, special ed director I have ever been associated with in my entire life. And I really fundamentally believe 10 years from now, the people of Middleborough will still be happy with the fact that she's the superintendent of this district. So thanks for listening.
Mr. Chair?
Yeah.
I would really love an opportunity to follow up on some of the things that I heard, not from Ms. Lyons, but from people that, now that I've heard them, I think would be able to give me a little more insight on. And as a result, I would like to make a motion that we push this decision to next week.
This is not normally a procedure that we do, Rich, and I'll be honest with you. The reason is because of the decision of this group. I really think we have to move to a decision of what we do tonight to play out. I don't know how, this is my own personal opinion, I don't know how waiting is going to be helpful. What will be helpful to me is to make a decision and to proceed with what the next steps are. Because if we get to next meeting, I want to have some idea of where we're going with those next steps. Greg?
So, when we first started this process, we agreed that we would open up the position to internal candidates. We would interview those candidates. We'd make a decision. Then if we didn't find a suitable candidate that we were all happy with, we would move on to an external search, which would require hiring an interim superintendent, because this will take a lot more time to get a search firm hired and all that stuff. So I guess I'm comfortable. I think Ms. Lyons has put herself out there. She has done more than I can imagine. The whole time she's sitting there, I just put myself in her shoes going, I could not do what she's doing. I think we owe it to Ms. Lyons. I think we need to make a decision. Maybe this has been going on. If you don't have by tonight enough information, I don't know what else you need.
Sure.
Okay, I really don't.
Yeah.
I'm just sitting here going, if we make everybody wait, I don't know, like Mr. Young said, I don't know what that buys us. We're not gonna get another candidate, right? So, I think we need to make a decision, and we've done the first part of the process. We've had the interviews. I think we make a decision. Is that what I'm hearing, Mr. Young?
Yeah.
We agreed to the process, we make a decision. If we don't think Ms. Caroline's is the right position, then we move to an external search. Now, maybe if we vote no tonight on Ms. Lyons and she applies in the external, everybody can still apply in the external. External means everybody can apply.
Correct.
So, that can just open up the whole game again. But I think we owe it. I think we owe it to the process that we decided unanimously to at least make a decision.
Do you want to make a motion for discussion?
I would like to make the motion that we,
I already made a motion.
oh, but you didn't get a
We don't have
second.
Get an opportunity to second it. If there's no seconds, it's fine. I just want to make sure. Okay.
Greg?
So-
So normally the motion would be to offer the candidate a contract as superintendent, subject to the negotiations. Sure, please.
Outline, because like I said, I haven't done this process before. So if we do decide to go externally, what does that look like? So now what happens? What's the timeline we're talking about? All of that stuff. That's going to help me kind of.
It would be my recommendation to the committee to hire a search firm. There are a lot of different search firms, but I would be required to get 3 different search firms. I need to get their proposals and to make sure they fall within the bid guidelines of Massachusetts, and I would come to the committee. I don't know that I could do it necessarily in 1 week, because I have to make sure I get the physical proposals. Yes?
Yeah,
Depending on the cost, if it's going to be over $50,000, we would actually have to go out to bid for it.
Right.
And that requires,
And it's not. Most of the proposals that I've seen are in the $12,000 to $15,000 issue. I would get the proposals, bring them to committee. I would recommend a firm to the committee. And then after we recommended the firm, then we'd have to schedule time with the firm. They would come out. Then they would set up a process of how long this would take. There were things, they would set up external candidates, go through a screening process, everything like that. It will probably, a minimum take at some point. So let's say if it played out in April, just using that. By the next meeting in April, we could meet with them, and then they'd start that process. So we'd be looking at candidates sometime within end of summer, early September. Those candidates would then have to come here in a similar interview. We don't necessarily have to do this, but to be honest with you, it is a normal procedure that we would go out to their districts and do what's called a site visitation. We do those site visitations, and then we have to negotiate what time they could start depending on their contracts. So let's say a best case scenario, we finish at end of summer and September we're making the decision. Most contracts have anywhere from a 60 to 120 day window. So you're looking anywhere end of December, early beginning of the following year. On top of that, July 1st, we don't have a superintendent. So I would talk to MASC. They provide me with a list of potential superintendents. What normally happens is I go through that list like I did last time. I look for people who have been in sort of similar districts. I do sort of phone interviews with them, go through their recommendation, their resume and everything like that, and then I would more than likely bring a candidate back to you sometime it'd probably be end of April, early May, and they would take over for the district. So that would be the process. Does that make sense to me?
Yes.
Any questions about the process?
No, that actually really helps me because that just sounds awful. And it just sounds having nobody in charge as of July 1st, essentially, is awful to me. And then we're going, almost half a school year with nobody in charge either, because we're still going through that process. So that helps me kind of sway my mind one way or the other. So.
And a couple things related to, that's important to do that I think is important to know. Sometimes when you get a firm, sometimes the firms will ask you to wait, okay? And the reason they want you to wait is this, is if your area has a lot of superintendents leaving, there's a lot of people, you're essentially vying for this, at times for the same pool. And what you will encounter sometimes is you may get the same candidates that everyone's come down to. And normally what happens is the school committee asks for 3 to 5 as a number. Okay, so the screening committee wills it down to 3 to 5. Part of the problem that they run into is when you get to that 3 to 5, you're competing against, like I said, other school districts, so sometimes you're down to less numbers because they're whittling away. The other thing I want to say about that process too, because I've seen it and I think it's important. Think about it this way. One of the first questions that the search firm asks you, do you have internal candidates? And then their answer is, well, why don't we just search the internal candidates first? But then there's another piece too that I think is important. If I'm hearing the committee again and telling me they like Carolyn Lyons, right, and everything working out, they're going to ask the representative. The candidates will call the representative and say, is there an internal candidate, and do they like her? And you're going to lose people based on that too, because people are going to be like, why am I going? Now, I should tell you, you'll hear a lot of times that you get you know, such and such a school got 50 candidates, right? Which sounds like a big pool. But then when you sit down with the person who runs it, they will tell you up front, there'll be a stack of 10 resumes that they tell you apply to every single superintendent opening in the world. And they said, we wouldn't take them. And then they go through the resumes of everybody else. And this is why it's important to have a search firm when you do it that way. They'll go through and tell you what the problem is with why this candidate's leaving their district, okay? One of my favorites from last time was there's a particular candidate who got fired by the school committee that would show up at the selectmen's meeting every Monday night, spend the public comment piece attacking the school committee for firing them at every single selectman meeting. And the person who told me this, I was just like, it's unbelievable. And sure enough, when I went to look, they did. So that's the process in a nutshell. No problem.
Mr. Chair, yeah, I just wanted to comment on that. I mean, I think hearing the process that we would have to go through to do an external search, it sounds like it would take an awful lot of time, and I'm really worried that not only would we spin our wheels time when a lot of other places are also looking for candidates, but I also fear that our very own candidate could get an offer externally, and we might lose her in that process as well. And so with that said, I just wanted to kind of clarify what I was asking for. I still believe that it would be the right decision to hire Ms. Lyons, and I've interviewed before, I've hired before, unfortunately fired before as well, and I personally have never stood up from an interview and been immediately ready to offer the job to someone, and that's all I was asking for, was just more time to consider what was said tonight. That's it, but I'm very much in favor of Ms. Lyons, and if given the choice, if there was no second to my motion, that's fine. Given the choice of looking externally and going through that process, or making a decision tonight, then I'm ready to make a decision tonight.
I agree with everything you said except one point.
Yeah.
Every other time you're hiring and making a decision, the person isn't sitting in front of a camera, right?
True.
And that's the piece I think Greg was talking about too, which is it prolongs a piece that is really, you know, I don't think anybody here has ever gone through an interview in which you're in front of the public, you're sitting there, you know, it's televised, everyone's watching. I've been through some interviews with a lot of people, right? But not like that. And so that's part of the reason why. And so I agree. So thank you, Rich. So
I'll make a motion to offer Ms. Caroline the position of superintendent for Middleborough Schools, subject to negotiation.
thank you. Do I hear a second?
Second.
Discussion. Please.
Here we are. So I think that each of us have given our true feelings on all of it. However, I'm one of 6, and I respect that this committee is coming to that decision this evening. And so that said, I will fully support this decision this evening, and my vote will be to extend that offer to Ms. Lyons. I want to see a unified frontier, and I don't think that it would do any good for us to be divided here. So I think that these last 2 years have been hard on everyone, and we need true unification. So if that's where we're at, then I'm comfortable with that, and I'm good. So thank you.
Any other discussion?
So, not discussion about the decision, but just about what happens next. Obviously, pending, whatever Greg said, pending.
Contract negotiation.
Yeah, what does that process look like? How long does that take? And when could we expect to have this be finalized?
Sure. So immediately after this, immediately next, I have an executive session to go into to discuss the potential future superintendent's contract. You will give me guidelines. I will sit down with Carolyn and negotiate a contract. And then I will bring it back to this body, and we will vote on it in open session where people can understand the guidelines. Part of it is I will go over some things with you after today, looking for those guidelines.
Got it.
Okay.
Thank you.
It's sort of practice, if no one minds, that for the vote for superintendent, I'll take a roll call vote if no one minds. Zeke? Teresa? Meg? Greg? Rich?
Aye.
And the chair votes aye to make it unanimous. So Carolyn, welcome to the Borough Superintendent. Thank you. With that, us having no further business, the chair would entertain a motion to move into executive session for procedure two, to conduct strategy sessions in preparation for negotiations with non-union personnel, or to conduct collective bargaining sessions or contract negotiations with non-union personnel, thus being the future superintendent. Do I have that motion?
So moved.
Second? Second. It requires a roll call vote. Zeke? Teresa? Meg? Greg? Rich?
Aye.
Chair votes aye. We will not only reconvene to adjourn. So thank you very much.